Hello, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for tuning in to Health Leaders, the place for peer sourced and solution focused insights for healthcare executives. My name is G. Hatfield, and I'm the CNO editor for Health Leaders. Today, we are speaking with Nicole Williams, who is the Director of Content and Test Development at the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, about the NCSBN's new comprehensive study on defining practice readiness for entry level nurses. So, hi, Nicole, how are you?
Hello, G. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. So this is a great topic today. I know there's a lot of CNOs who are struggling or facing the hurdle of the nursing education to practice readiness pipeline. So we're going to get into that today. So as the author of this new study, what
Mhm.
concerns or hurdles in the nursing industry inspired you to look into practice readiness for nurses?
I think, there, in terms of the hurdles in the nursing profession, I think we all agree there is quite a bit to unpack there. I would have to say that part of the passion and our interest in the examinations department at National Council of State Boards of Nursing is in entry level, newly licensed nurses practice.
Mhm.
How does it evolve over time and how does it function overall? Our main interest in that is so that we can develop a primary licensure application that assesses the knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to practice safely. So, several of the things that confound that area are newly licensed nurses themselves. We
Mhm.
know that as a nurse is new to practice, that they practice very differently, let's say, from someone who has been in practice existing for 5 to 10 years. And
Mhm.
it does take them a little bit of time in order for them to, so to speak, kind of get their sea legs to practice more autonomously. So we're definitely interested in that. We know that practice has evolved over the period of time. When we consider entry level practice, let's say 15, 20 years ago, entry level nurses did not necessarily enter into some of the high stakes clinical areas.
Mhm.
Licensure does not dictate a practice setting. In other words, when you get your license, you can work in a practice setting where they will hire you and they will onboard you in terms of the competencies that are related to that particular area. But there's no restriction to say that you can't work in that area. But I think
Mhm.
one of the things that we've seen over the years is an increase in newly licensed nurses working in, let's say, the emergency department and in critical care areas where the client acuity is higher. Therefore, you have to make more consistent and effective clinical judgments in those areas. We know that as newly licensed nurses, as they begin to kind of gain those practice experiences, they become to recognize patterns more regularly, recognize cues, and can readily synthesize those salient cues in order to make those effective clinical judgments. But
Mhm.
one of the things that we find nowadays is because of the areas that newly licensed nurses are beginning to practice in, because our client population is aging with more comorbidities, more polypharmacy, we find that there is a bit more urgency for new nurses to engage in effective clinical decision from the very beginning. So that's one of the impetus or several of the impetuses
Mhm.
that interested in us in doing a bit more work behind what is the entry level period for newly licensed nurses.
Absolutely. And to your point, things have changed in nursing over the years. New to practice nurses now have to know, about like virtual nursing and AI and all these new technologies that weren't there 20 years ago. So a lot has changed. So tell me about the results of the study. What are some of the key
Sure.
figures?
So one of the interesting things is, so for the respondents, we gathered almost about 200 nurses, and we were asking them essentially just one question around entry level nursing. In order to do that, we did have to provide them a bit of background. So it was about 200 nurses that either educated newly licensed nurses, supervised them, or were entry level nurses themselves. And
Mhm.
we gave them a lot of background similar to the discussion that we're having here. Many of the variables that impact the entry level practice period, such as our client population, the actual practice environment, where and the characteristics of newly licensed nurses. Now, when we consider newly licensed nurses, they come to new to practice, kind of bearing a number of characteristics,
Mhm.
such as they have a propensity not to be able to engage in consistent clinical judgment. They sometimes struggle with role acclimation and really understanding how to practice effectively on a regular, consistent basis.
Mhm.
In our profession, we have kind of a space where a newly licensed nurse practices with a more seasoned nurse. But unsimilar to other professions, the nursing profession doesn't have a defined timeline to say this is how long it takes you to practice with another seasoned nurse in order before you are completely autonomous and kind of on your own. And newly
Mhm.
licensed nurses really do depend on that supportive practice for a number of for a period of months. And the questions that we were asking the 200 nurses was just that: how long does it take before an entry level nurse, some of those characteristics begin to dissipate and they begin to engage in more autonomous practice?
Mhm.
And of those 200 nurses, about 74% of them stated it takes at least about no more than about 12 months.
Mhm.
Meaning, what that looks like is it takes a nurse that's new to practice at least up to about 12 months when they're engaging in the practice where they are deferring to their more seasoned colleagues to ask for that supportive help until they are then able to practice a bit more autonomously. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, you're good. I was just, yeah, I was just going to ask about the qualities you mentioned as well. What, as some of those kind of less desirable qualities kind of dissipate, what are some of the qualities and competencies you think do make a practice ready nurse?
That's a really good question. And I'm so excited that you're asking about that because I think that is an important question that we should be asking and discussing in our profession.
Mhm.
Because we know that newly licensed nurses come to practice understanding a lot of the knowledge pieces. We
Mhm.
know that they've learned quite a bit of that in their pre licensure education. We know that they have completed and were successful on the NCLEX. So we understand that they know a lot of the knowledge and the facts. One of the things that seems to be a bit of a disconnect is how do they process the information in order to arrive at an effective decision. And one of the key variables that we found is that in order to really support that area of what we call kind of practice readiness, is the ability to effectively engage in clinical judgment.
Mhm.
Now, one of the biggest things to consider around this, as we know, when you consider the Patricia Benner's model novice to expert, that as a newly licensed nurse practice more, they will gain more of those practice experiences and will be able to readily recall information in order to make effective decisions more rapidly. Where we find ourselves now in society, as I mentioned earlier, is that in the practice environment, newly licensed nurses have to make those decisions quicker and more effectively. So we find that clinical judgment is essentially a scaffolding for entry level nursing practice within that transition to practice period that really helps support patient safety. So it's not necessarily that we believe that they don't know the information. Absolutely, they do, because once again, they've passed the NCLEX. But there is that period where they would need that supportive practice in order to help them gain those experiences, coupled with the practice of clinical judgment to help synthesize the data in order to make more rapid decisions.
Mhm. Absolutely. So, with things like clinical judgment, what kind of metrics are used to measure that and also some of the other qualities and competencies you're mentioning?
So what we do with the NCLEX, we actually measure clinical judgment on the NCLEX. We do that in a number of different ways. So
Mhm.
when I think of clinical judgment, I think of that almost from a kind of a transition period, whereas it starts in pre-licensure education, we
Mhm.
assess it on the NCLEX, and it also exists in the transition to practice period. So I'd like to kind of talk about it in two places. One is on the NCLEX. And as I mentioned, we assess it and we develop assessment items in order to develop various component or various parts of the clinical judgment model,
Mhm.
from recognizing those salient cues all the way through analyzing outcomes. And once again, what that does is it really helps hardwire the thinking and decision making so that entry level nurses can recognize problems, synthesize information to figure out a plan of approach, and then to evaluate whether that intervention was effective. If not, then they kind of return to the beginning at analyzing cues again to figure out, what's going on. If not, if it was effective, then they would continue to go on to the next, kind of priority problem that
Mhm.
the client is facing. One of the things that we do find is that it is important, and actually, it's a lot of information in the literature, is that that thinking and shaping of that framework should continue after the assessment of NCLEX. So
Mhm.
they learned about it in school, pre-licensure education. We assess it on the NCLEX, and we're seeing a lot of data that that paradigm should continue in that transition to practice period. Once again, when newly licensed nurses still need that supportive practice and helping shape not only the knowledge, but how they think and process and make information. So, and if you talk about some of the assessment or the framework, it is just kind of using some kind of framework around clinical judgment and thinking in the transition to practice period as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. And, when you talk about taking that next step after the NCLEX and once they are transitioning into practice, for CNOs and health systems, why does standardizing practice readiness among nurses really matter? What does that impact?
Wow, now you really hit the nail on the head, G. It is essentially important because, as I mentioned earlier, at the top of the call, that in our profession there is no designated time frame in which this practice supported period should end. In other professions, there is a defined supervised practice period where a novice physician or advanced beginner physician would practice under a more seasoned physician.
Mhm.
In nursing, we do have that paradigm, but there's no defined period on when it should end.
Mhm.
For our purposes, we find that it's important to define that period so we better understand that we can assess what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required for an entry level nurse to practice safely within that period. Because within that period, once again, there's still under the framework of needing more supervision and more supportive care. So I think one of the things that is kind of universally of interest is for practice partners, CNOs, to consider how long does that period last, because that's the amount of time that a newly licensed nurse will need that additional support and resources.
Absolutely. So during that time frame of that 12-month period or however long, the CNO decides to have that period be at their own health system, how can they ensure that those new to practice nurses are ready and confident in delivering care to patients?
Great question. Many institutions have found success in more formalized transition to practice programs.
Mhm.
We have the ability to analyze entry level nursing practice over the years. We conduct what we call a NCLEX practice analysis, where we are gathering data from newly licensed nurses over the number of years. And we've analyzed that data set for, let's say, the past 30 years. And we've seen that within the last 15 years, that more entry level nurses are reporting that they are engaging in those transition to practice programs on average, which are about 13 weeks. And the one thing that we do know about transition to practice programs, or what one would consider a nurse residency, is that they do have some variability. Once again, there's no defined rule around how long a nurse residency should last. But we do see that within that framework, that institutions are providing that supportive resources to entry level nurses, such as kind of a hybrid between some kind of curriculum as well as supportive practice on the unit with a preceptor, other resources such as mentors and coaches. So it really helps the entry level nurse become more well acclimated as they're beginning to gain those more clinical experiences. And once again, really recognizing that the entry level nurse is quite different from a newly from another nurse that has been in practice a bit longer, and they're going to need that supportive care within that transition to practice period.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for your time. I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity to get to know you a little bit and hear your insights. And thank you so much to our audience for listening. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me, G.
Of course.